Look at the size of that thing!
Dude, that's not a bear! That's not a bear! My name is Mark, and I found out that my own kids are playing with Bigfoot. I thought they were talking about their new friend, but they were instead playing with the most terrifying monster possible, because what Bigfoot did to my children is so awful that I'm here to expose what he's truly capable of. My kids are Della, who was 9, and Owen, who was 6. We had moved to the property 8 months earlier after I got a divorce. A 4-bedroom on 2 acres in a rural county about 90 minutes from the nearest city, backing up to Forest Service land that stretched unbroken for miles. There was a lot of space for 3 people. That was the point. The price was right, because the nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile up the road and most buyers wanted to be closer to things. We did not know what was already back there in the trees. The kids found the edge of the property within their first week. There was a fence line, post and wire, old sagging in sections, and beyond it, the Forest Service land started. And I had told them clearly, fence is the line. You don't cross the fence. They nodded the way 9- and 6-year-olds nod when they have already decided what they're going to do. They crossed the fence. I didn't find out for 3 weeks. I found out because Della came home with a handful of plants she wanted to identify. Specific plants, named by location, described with a precision that a 9-year-old does not come up with on her own. She said her friend had shown her where they grew. I said, "What friend?" She said, "The big one in the woods." I said, "How big?" She looked at me with the specific patience children reserve for adults who are missing something obvious. She held her hand up as high as she could reach. Then she pointed at the ceiling. Then she shrugged, as if the ceiling wasn't high enough to finish the point. I told her not to go into the woods alone. I called it a safety talk. What it actually was the first moment I felt something I couldn't name, yet moved through my chest. Not quite fear, not quite anything I had a word for. I went out that evening and walked the fence line. I found a section on the northeast corner where something had pressed against the wire repeatedly enough to bow it outward. Not broken, not forced, just leaned on. At a height that didn't match my kids. At a height that didn't match much of anything I could think of standing there in the evening light looking at the bent wire with the forest going dark behind it. I straightened the wire and went back inside and told myself it was deer. It was not deer. I need to give you the shape of the next 3 weeks before I tell you what I saw, because the shape of those weeks is what made what I saw impossible to dismiss or explain away or file somewhere reasonable. The kids were different, not in a way that scared me. That's important. They were not withdrawn or secretive or showing any signs I'd been trained to watch for. They were better, more settled. Owen had been having nightmares since the move, and they stopped. Della had been quiet in the way of a kid holding something too heavy for her age, and she started talking again. At dinner, in the car, the running commentary of a child who has remembered that the world is interesting. I noticed, and I didn't question it hard enough. I was exhausted and barely keeping everything moving, and my kids were doing better. I did not look hard enough at why. They told me things in the way kids tell you things. Sideways, embedded in other conversations, offered and then moved past before you can respond. Owen told me at breakfast one morning that their friend didn't talk the way we talk, but that Della was learning. He said it the way you'd say someone was learning French. Informational. Then he asked if we had any more of the orange juice. Della told me their friend liked the apples from the tree at the property line. She told me it didn't like loud sounds. She told me it was teaching her something about where the creek went, information she described with a geographic specificity I couldn't account for. I asked how she knew. She said her friend showed her, walked her through it. I asked, "Walked you where?" She named locations half a mile into Forest Service land that she had no business being in and had definitely accessed through the fence I had told her not to cross. I should have gone to the tree line that night. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table after the kids were in bed and pulled up every Bigfoot account I could find in the Pacific Northwest and read until 2 in the morning. Then I closed the laptop and sat in the dark and told myself I was not entertaining the idea. I was very much entertaining the idea. I set up a camera, trail camera, the same model I used to monitor deer on client properties. Mounted it at the northeast corner of the fence line. I checked it 3 mornings in a row and found deer, a raccoon, a porcupine, and nothing else. On the 4th morning, the camera was on the ground, not knocked over, placed down, carefully, face up. The mount was still on the post. The camera had been detached and set on the ground with deliberateness. Memory card still in it. The last image before the lens went skyward was a frame of darkness and a shape at the edge of the frame that I have looked at many times since and cannot describe with precision. Large, upright, close. That was the morning I stopped telling myself it was deer. I bought 2 more cameras and mounted all 3 that evening higher on the posts, secured with zip ties. The next morning, all 3 were on the ground, placed carefully, face up. The footage showed the same shape at the frame's edge, moving without urgency, then the image tilting as the camera was removed from its mount. Whatever it was had hands. Whatever it was knew what a camera was. I called in sick to work for the first time in 6 years. Sat in my truck at the end of the driveway thinking about the fact that something with the dexterity to remove a zip-tied camera mount had been at my fence line at least 4 times in 8 days, and my kids had been crossing that fence line every afternoon. Then I went inside and looked at Owen's drawings. He drew constantly. I had not looked closely in weeks. There were maybe 30 drawings tacked above his desk. Most were what you'd expect: houses, cars, his sister, me. But interspersed with those, appearing more and more frequently the further right along the wall I looked, were drawings of something else. A figure, large. Owen drew it relative to the trees, and the trees only came to its shoulders. Dense, layered marks for fur or hair. Always the same posture, standing at the edge of the trees, at the fence, one hand raised, waving. Owen had been drawing a Bigfoot waving at him for at least 6 weeks, and I had not noticed. I sat on the edge of his bed for a long time. Then I knocked on Della's door. She was 11 days from her 10th birthday. Smart in the way that made her teachers call me every September, and perceptive in the way that made those same teachers look slightly uncomfortable. She knew immediately that something had shifted. She said, "You found the cameras?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I told it you were going to put cameras up." I told it not to break them. I said, "Just move them." I sat down on her desk chair and said, "Della, tell me everything." She did. It had been 17 days. She had crossed the fence looking for the creek, which she had heard from the property but not yet found. She found the creek. She also found something sitting beside it. Large, covered in dark reddish-brown fur, sitting on a rock at the creek's edge the way a person sits, not crouching, not on all fours, watching the water. It heard her before she saw it. It turned its head before she made a sound, and it looked at her. I asked, "Were you scared?" She said she was for about 3 seconds. Then it held its hand out, not toward her, just open, resting on the rock beside it, and something about that stopped the scared. She went back the next day, and the day after that. She brought Owen on the 4th day. I asked why she hadn't told me. She said, "Because you would have stopped it." She was right, and I was not fully certain, sitting on her desk chair, that stopping it would have been the correct decision. I told her I needed to see it myself. She said, "I know. It knows too." We went out the next afternoon, me, Della, Owen, through the fence at the northeast corner, down the slope toward the creek. Della led with a confidence in the terrain she had not had 8 months ago. Owen held my hand, not frightened, just contained. The excitement of a kid who knows something good is coming. The creek was about 400 meters from the fence, 30 feet wide, moving fast with spring runoff, old growth firs on both sides thick enough to cut the Issei afternoon light. It was there, on the far bank, standing. I am 6'1". I have framed enough buildings to know heights instinctively. What was standing on the far bank was between 8 and 9 feet. The shoulders, not just the height, the shoulders, were wide in a way I could not fit into any human or animal frame I had. Wide the way load-bearing things are wide. It looked at me with a directed, specific attention. Not aggression, not fear. Something I can only call evaluation. The warm kind, the kind that contains intelligence behind it. Della said quietly, "It's okay, Dad." Owen let go of my hand and took 3 steps toward the bank. I grabbed for him. Della caught my arm. She shook her head. She said, "Watch." Owen raised one hand. The same gesture from the drawings. From the far bank, a hand went up. The hand alone was the size of Owen's upper body, raised slowly, held open, then lowered. Owen grinned like he'd been waiting weeks to show me exactly this. I stood at that creek bank for 40 minutes. I watched my kids interact with a Bigfoot the way children interact with something they fully trust, easily, without performance. Della moved to the bank and made sounds I had never heard her make, structured tones she produced with visible concentration. Something came back from the far bank. Same register, different pattern, back and forth. She was communicating with it. My daughter was standing at a creek in the Pacific Northwest having a conversation with a Bigfoot, and I was standing 10 feet behind her, trying to remember how to breathe. I asked her afterward what they were saying. She said it wasn't like translating, more like knowing. Direction, intention, the way you read an expression but through sound instead of face. She said it had been asking about me for days. She had told it I was having a hard time. It told her that hard times are what the trees do in winter, that being bare and cold isn't the same as being dead. My 9-year-old daughter delivered that to me, standing beside a creek in the dark firs, and I stood there with it and did not say anything for a long time. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark and ran the inventory. 8 or 9 feet, shoulders like load-bearing structure, a hand raised in response to my 6-year-old's hand, eye contact that contained something I could only call intelligence. My daughter producing sounds she did not know 3 weeks ago and being answered in kind. I am a practical person. I solve problems for a living. Materials, load, weather, code. I am not someone who lies in the dark and circles something without a solution path. I lay in the dark for 4 hours. What kept coming back was not the size, it was the hand. Owen's hand going up and the hand on the far bank going up in return. Slow, deliberate, the same shape returned. Whatever was on that bank had watched my son long enough to know that was his greeting, had learned it, had decided to use it back. That is not instinct. That is not territorial behavior. That is something paying close attention to a 6-year-old boy and choosing to respond to him on his terms. I did not know if that should make me feel better or worse. It made me feel both in equal measure at 2 in the morning, alone in a house that backed up to 40 miles of forest I now understood differently than I had the day before. I decided we would not go back. I told Della the next morning. She listened the way she listened when she had already prepared her counter-argument. She said it hadn't hurt them. She said it had been nothing but careful. She said I was making a decision based on fear, and that wasn't fair. She was 9 years old and she was right, and I still said no. I want to be honest about what those 4 days looked like because they matter for understanding what came after. The first day was manageable. I kept the kids in, gave them screens and snacks and the kind of guilt-driven parenting that happens when you know you're overriding something your child cares about and you don't have a clean argument for it. Della was cold with me in the efficient way she had when she'd registered a decision as unjust and was cataloging it for future reference. Owen was quieter than usual, but not distressed. The second day, I walked the fence line alone at dusk. I told myself I was checking the perimeter. What I was actually doing was standing at the bowed section of wire and looking into the trees and trying to decide what I was more afraid of, what was in there, or what my kids were becoming in relation to it. I didn't have an answer. I went back inside. The third day, I called my sister, who is the person I call when I am not sure I am thinking clearly. I did not tell her about the Bigfoot. I told her the kids had been going into the woods beyond the fence line, and I wasn't comfortable with it, and I had told them to stop, and now Owen wasn't sleeping. She said, kids need outside. She said, you're probably overcorrecting because of the divorce. She said, let them have something that's theirs. She did not know what she was giving advice about. I did not tell her. I sat on the phone for another 10 minutes talking about other things, and then I hung up and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the tree line. That lasted 4 days. Owen stopped sleeping. Not nightmares, worse. He would just sit up in bed and look at the window, alert and quiet, the way he'd been when I told him his mother and I were splitting. I found him at 2 in the morning sitting at the back door, looking at the tree line, not upset, just waiting. I asked what he was waiting for. He said, it comes to the fence at night sometimes, to check. I stood in my kitchen at 2 in the morning and stared at my 6-year-old son, and something cold moved through me that I am still not fully able to describe. Not because of what he said, because of how he said it, the total absence of fear in his voice. The same way he'd say the mail comes in the afternoon or the sun sets over there. It had been coming to the fence at night. It had been 10 meters from my sleeping children. And my son found this unremarkable. I took them back to the creek the next afternoon, not because I had changed my mind, because I understood by then that the decision had already been made without me, and that my job was to be there when it was made. The second visit was different from the first. We came down the slope to the bank, and it was already on our side. Not the far bank, our side. Standing in the trees about 50 feet upstream, at the edge of the fir line, in a posture I had not seen before. Upright but tense, the shoulders set differently, the head angled toward the slope above us rather than toward me or the kids. Della stopped walking. I said, "What's wrong?" She said, "Something's coming." I heard it before I saw it. A different set of sounds from higher on the slope. Not wood knocking, not anything structured, more like the forest rearranging itself. Branches, weight on ground, plural, more than one something moving down through the trees toward the creek from the northeast. The one at the tree line made a sound I had not heard it make before. Short, percussive, one impact, and then silence, and whatever was on the slope stopped. I do not know how long we stood there. Long enough that my arms had gone to my kids without me deciding to move them, one hand on each of them, pulling them close without looking down. Long enough for the creek sound to come back in my awareness. Long enough for me to understand that I had no plan, no weapon, no training, no framework for what I would do if something came through that tree line. I am a contractor. I build things. I have never been in a situation where my body understood the danger before my mind did, and I had nothing to offer either of them. The sounds on the slope shifted, not retreating yet, waiting. Whatever was up there was receiving information and deciding what to do with it. The one at our tree line made the sound again. Same register, different length. And the slope sounds changed, slower, then stopping, then the unmistakable crashing retreat of something large moving fast back up through the brush away from us. Whatever had been coming down that slope was gone in about 15 seconds. The one at the tree line turned its head and looked at us. Della said very quietly, "It told them to go." I asked what they were. She said she didn't know. She said it felt different from it, older. She said the word it used for them didn't translate. I want to sit with that for a moment because I think it is the most important thing my daughter has ever said to me, even though she was 9 and said it like she was reporting the weather. The word it used for them didn't translate. There is a something in those trees that my daughter can partially communicate with, and that something used a word for the others, the ones on the slope, that did not have an equivalent in any language Della had access to, which means the others are sufficiently different from the one we knew that there was no common term, which means the categories out there in that forest do not map onto anything I have a word for. I got my kids home in under 10 minutes. I did not look back at the tree line. I got them through the fence and across the property and inside the house, and I locked the back door, and I stood in the kitchen with my heart running at a rate I hadn't felt since I was in a car accident at 24. Della sat down at the kitchen table and was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "It protected us. I know that is what happened. Something came down that slope, and it was not the one we knew, and the one we knew sent it back. That is the fact of it. But here is the other fact. There are more of them. The one we knew about was the one that left granite pieces and lowered itself to the ground, so Della didn't have to look up so far. We knew that one. We had built something with that one over weeks of creek visits and structured sound and a 6-year-old's open hand. We did not know what else was in the corridor. We still don't. On the 6th visit, the one we knew brought something, left it at the creek bank before we arrived. A piece of granite threaded with a wide vein of white quartz, smooth from years in the water, too specific to be accidental. Owen picked it up and said, "It's for us." He still has it on his windowsill. I look at it differently now than I did before the slope. We went back 3 more times after that. Each visit followed roughly the same shape. It was there, on the bank or on our side, quiet and attentive. Della moved closer than I was comfortable with, and I let her, because I had learned by then that my comfort was not the relevant variable. Owen stood at the bank and held his hand up, and the hand on the far bank went up in return, and it was the closest thing to a ritual I had ever witnessed that I did not invent or understand. On the 8th visit, it was already across when we arrived, not at the tree line, closer, maybe 30 feet, sitting against the base of a fir, the way it had sat at the creek that first day Della found it. Owen walked toward it without hesitation. He sat down on the ground about 10 feet away, and they were there for 20 minutes, and I stood behind them and did not move and watched my 6-year-old son sit in silence with a Bigfoot in the forest behind my house. I did not have a name for what I was feeling. I still don't. What I do know is that on every walk back, I checked the upper slope. The sounds from the 2nd visit were never repeated, but the checking became involuntary, the new habit of a man who understood that the forest had layers, and that the one he had been introduced to was not the deepest one. The 10th visit was the last. We went at our usual time, mid-afternoon. The creek was loud with late spring runoff. The firs threw long shadows. It was not there. We waited an hour. Della made the sounds at the bank and got nothing back. Owen sat on a rock with the particular stillness he had developed over the weeks, and I watched him and thought about the 2 in the morning visits to the back door and the thing he found unremarkable. Della said, "It's gone, not from the creek. Gone, gone." I heard it in her voice. We walked back in the late afternoon. Owen held my jacket. Della's shoulders carried something she didn't have words for yet. That night at dinner, nobody talked much. Owen got the granite piece and put it in the middle of the table, and we all looked at it. Then he said, "It'll come back." I asked how he knew. He said, "Because we're here." He said it with total certainty. The same certainty he had standing at the back door at 2 in the morning watching the tree line. I did not find that comforting. I have been back to the creek 8 times since the last visit. Tracks every time. Large, fresh, the stride I can't match. It is in the corridor. It has not come to the fence the way it was coming, but it is there. And twice, once on the 3rd visit, once on the 7th, I heard the other sounds. Not from the creek, from further up the slope, behind the old growth, moving parallel to my route, and staying back just enough to stay out of sight. Not the one I know. I know that sound now, its weight and its register, and the particular way it moves through the firs with a deliberateness that has its own signature. This was not that. This was faster, less careful, moving with the kind of indifference to noise that suggests it was not trying to be anything other than what it was. I don't know if it was following me or if I was simply moving through territory it was already occupying. I don't know if that distinction matters. I put one camera back at the fence. 3rd morning, it was on the ground. Same placement, face up, lens at the sky. I left it where it was. 3 days later, it was back on the post, adjusted slightly, angled toward the Forest Service land. I am not sure anymore whether that is reassurance or instruction. My kids know it's still out there. Owen goes to the fence line some evenings and stands there in the way he learned from watching it be still. Some nights I look out the kitchen window and he's there in the near dark, very quiet, looking at the trees. Last week I went out to bring him in and he held up one finger without turning around. "Wait." I waited. The tree line was dark. The firs were black against the last of the light. I stood there for 30 seconds, 40, and I heard nothing except the wind in the upper branches and the far sound of the creek. Then Owen dropped his hand and turned around and came inside. I asked what he had heard. He said, "Nothing." Then he said, "Not yet." He said it with a 6-year-old's complete confidence, walking past me into the kitchen, and I stood at the fence line alone in the falling dark, and I looked at the trees and I thought about the slope. The word it used for them didn't translate. I have been standing at that fence line 3-4 times a week since, not because I expect to see the one we know, because I am trying to do what Owen does. Stand still, stay open. Let the information come at whatever rate it comes. Last Tuesday I heard something from the slope I could not identify. Not the creek, not the wind, not any animal sound I have cataloged in the 8 months I have lived here. Structured, brief, in a register lower than anything I have heard the one we know produce. It did not repeat. I stood there for 20 minutes in the dark. Nothing else came. But I have not told the kids what I heard, because I do not know what it means yet. And I am their father, and some information needs to stay with the person who can do something about it. The problem is, I am not sure what that something is. Della asked me last night at dinner whether I thought it would come back. I said I thought it was still in the corridor. She said, "That's not what I asked." She was right. That was not what she asked. I told her I didn't know. She nodded like she had expected that answer and was already working around it. I am 38 years old. I have built things with my hands my whole life. I know how structures work, what makes something hold, what to do when the ground shifts underneath you. The ground has shifted. I do not know what is in those trees. Not all of it, not the full depth of it. I know one layer. I do not know how many layers there are. And somewhere on that slope, in a register I am only beginning to be able to hear, something is using a word my daughter cannot translate. I think about that every night. I think about it at 2 in the morning when the house is quiet and Owen is asleep and the back of my property is dark and still. I check the lock on the back door, and then I stand at the kitchen window and I look at the tree line, and I wonder What is looking back?